Across Alberta, around 500,000 oil and gas wells are located, nearly 100,000 of which are no longer producing. That doesn't mean just some old equipment around an empty well. These sites pollute their surrounding environments, many of them located on people's farms or properties. The estimated cost to clean up these wells varies, from $33 billion into hundreds of billions of dollars. Experts have suggested that these wells could lead to a financial and environmental catastrophe if not addressed. Meanwhile, the oil and gas industry, who are required to pay to clean up their own wells, have found it easier and easier to pass that responsibility onto taxpayers, while the government has appointed oil and gas executives to lead the province's strategy on their energy future. So why are there so many of these abandoned wells in the province, when the law requires that oil and gas companies clean up their inactive wells? And is the provincial government and its regulators looking out for the best interest of Albertans or the oil and gas industry? If you picture how oil is extracted, maybe you picture huge operations like the tar sands, and certainly that's part of it. But many, thousands upon thousands of oil wells across Alberta look like this, a small operation on a private piece of land. Many farmers or private individuals have leased portions of their land to oil companies for decades, enjoying extra passive income. For the record, those landowners do not get to decide whether or not to lease land to these companies. Their land is expropriated. But landowners are expected to be able to negotiate the terms of the lease. Theoretically, it's a good deal. Give up a bit of your land, make some money. When the well stops producing, the company is required to restore it as closely to its original condition as possible. Everyone wins. But thousands of those landowners have become part of an all too common cycle. For a variety of different reasons, the company that owns the well goes out of business. The company can't afford to properly safety seal the well and then clean it up, so instead they go bankrupt and walk away. In those cases, the wells pass into the management of the Orphan Well Association, which manages well over 10,000 oil and gas assets in the province. The OWA is supposed to be funded by industry levies to clean up those orphaned wells, except the province and its regulators have substantially undercharged on those levies for decades, meaning there's not even close to enough money to clean up those wells. They just sit there. 10,000 oil and gas assets is also only a tiny amount of the real problem. As of November 2024, there were 470,673 licenses for oil and gas wells in Alberta. More than 78,000 of those were inactive, meaning they haven't produced for at least 6 to 12 months. And 99,000 are marginal, meaning they produce less than 10 barrels of oil equivalent per day. These wells pose serious environmental, public health, and economic risks. Many of them leak contaminants into the air, soil, and water, such as methane. Individuals living near these wells show increased incidence of various lung diseases, cancers, heart attacks, heart failures, stroke, birth defects, premature births, and low birth weights. Even inactive wells pollute the environment around them, which makes it more expensive to reclaim the well in the long term. Essentially meaning the longer it takes to clean up abandoned or orphaned wells, the more people get sick, and the more it costs to clean them up. But this crisis is decades in the making. Alberta has long had a polluter pays policy, meaning that the oil and gas industry is on the hook for cleaning up their own wells. Which makes sense. You profit from a well, you pay to clean it up when it stops being profitable. Except policy and regulations never really made this a priority. Since beginning operations in 2002, the OWA has received $844 million in industry funding through levies that are set by the AER, the province's regulator. In 2019, a sharp downturn in the price of oil led to a lot of oil and gas companies becoming insolvent in Alberta. The AER predicted between a 160 to 480% increase in the Orphan Well Association's inventory, or more simply, an increase from 9,703 wells to more than 56,000. At the time, the regulator only had $224 million of securities on hand, while facing $30.2 billion in liabilities. But the AER and OWA were in a tough spot, because they couldn't ask for more levies from oil companies across the board to clean up the huge increase in abandoned wells, since demanding more levies could put even more oil companies out of business. leading to even more abandoned wells. But even $30.2 billion was not an appropriate estimate. The regulator's calculations showed that 80% of reclaimed wells that have been fully removed to return the landscape to roughly its original form, never produced oil or gas. Wells that never produce oil or gas are much easier and cheaper to clean up. Taking that into account by the regulator's own estimates, the actual liability cost could be 2.5 times higher. Changes that began in 2020 gave the regulator more power to assess the financial health of companies and act proactively if they see signs of distress, as well as significantly increase security transfers from $389,000 in 2020 to more than $11 million in 2022. It's virtually impossible to play catch-up. There is no economically feasible way to extract enough levies from oil and gas companies to clean up orphaned wells in a reasonable time frame, without specifically targeting the biggest companies in the province, something that will not happen under this government, as we will get into in a minute. And the changes that allow the regulator to act proactively if companies were in financial trouble often meant that companies that were barely scraping by were given licenses and propped up, meaning that wells didn't become orphans, but also meant those companies weren't able to pay their orphan levies, thus simply delaying the problem for later, when they would eventually go bankrupt. A 2023 Auditor General report found that despite these changes, the regulator was still not properly assessing companies to see if they were financially stable enough to be given licenses. Seeing as industry wasn't going to pay for abandoned wells, Alberta embraced a new plan under a new government led by Danielle Smith, a plan that Smith herself had lobbied for while working as an oil and gas lobbyist, one that would take the pressure off of oil and gas companies and put it on Alberta taxpayers. Back in 2021, while working as a lobbyist, Danielle Smith approached the government with the idea for a pilot program, initially called R-STAR, later called the Site Liability Incentive Program. The program offers up to $100 million in royalty credits to companies that clean up inactive wells that are at least 20 years old. These are wells that have been safety sealed but not reclaimed. The $100 million in credits would go towards drilling new wells for that company. This goes against the polluter pays principle, and instead puts the burden of hundreds of millions or maybe billions of dollars on Alberta taxpayers. Smith has said that ideally, polluters would pay to clean up their own mess, but that $30 billion worth of liability can't continue to be kicked down the road and not addressed. And she has a point. The OWA has already taken extensive loans from the Alberta government for their operations. Between 2017 and 2020, they received $335 million in loans, but their inventory continues to increase. But even then, the Site Liability Incentive Program largely only benefits the companies who don't need it. There are a number of stipulations that state a company can only receive the credit if they don't owe taxes or payments to Indigenous communities or a number of other similar outstanding payments. Which makes sense. Why give a grant to a company that can't pay its obligations? Except that not being able to pay their obligations is what has created this problem in the first place. Cenovus and CNRL don't need $100 million to clean up their old wells. Companies that are struggling to pay their taxes do. Yet instead, big companies will receive credits from taxpayers while they pay out billions in dividends to their shareholders, and small companies will continue to go under, putting the burden on the OWA. The federal government had realized that this was a problem and decided to help out back in 2020. They pledged $1.7 billion to Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan to give out as grants to oil companies to clean up their wells. $1 billion of that went to Alberta. Former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the money was supposed to go towards abandoned and orphaned wells and helping companies that were struggling to be financially stable so they could clean up their wells. However, records of how the money was spent in Alberta are poor, and the records that were kept show that more than half of the money was given to companies that were financially secure. 44% was given to oil giants CNRL and Cenovus. Theoretically, a way to enforce the polluter pay principle and actually get these wells cleaned up is to simply demand more in levies and action from the oil giants in the province who make billions in profits every year. But that's not likely to happen, considering the close connections of members of the Alberta government and the AER to the oil and gas industry. The levy that the AER selects is done behind closed doors, with no public consultation. One of the people responsible for that decision is David Yeager, an AER board member, oil and gas consultant, Daniel Smith loyalist, and special advisor to the Premier. Those are not his previous jobs. He does all of those things at the same time. Dwight Popovich, a landowner who has had an abandoned well on his property for 13 years, along with Eco-Justice, has filed a request with Alberta's Ethics Commissioner to initiate a probe on Yeager for conflicts of interest, saying that Yeager cannot simultaneously look out for Albertans' best interest as a member of the AER board, while also being a consultant for the oil and gas industry and an advisor to the Premier. It's important to clarify here, the AER is supposed to be at an arm's length to the government, allowing it to act independently without influence from government officials. Yeager and Smith go way back to the Wild Rose Party days, when Yeager was Smith's biggest fundraiser in her bid for leadership of the party. The two have been closely connected ever since. Yeager has received at least 4 sole-sourced contracts worth about $500,000 from the government, including a contract that runs until February of 2026. One of those contracts is from Alberta Energy for professional services. Another is a $60,000 contract to work on an advisory council on Alberta's energy future, which gained input from over 160 industry executives to produce a final report that was never made public. Another $70,000 contract had Yeager as part of a 5-person team reviewing the AER at the Premier's request. The results of that review found that the AER should be more responsive to industry. The other 4 members on that team were a board member of Cenovus, the former director of the AER, the president of a pipelines company, and the president of an energy company. What are the chances that such a board would decide that the regulator should favor industry? It's a mystery. When Yeager was appointed to the AER board in 2024, he was in the midst of a $136,000 sole-sourced contract with the government to develop the Mature Asset Strategy, or MAS, which was a plan intended to reduce the number of inactive oil and gas wells. He then received another $156,000 sole-sourced contract through February 2026, likely related to implementing the MAS. The MAS is in a way a different approach to making taxpayers pay to clean up old wells. Initially, the MAS proposed 2 government-funded companies that would acquire and then clean up old wells, as well as an insurance fund that should be funded by industry but backstopped by taxpayers. After backlash, the explicit suggestion that the fund would be backstopped by taxpayers was removed, but the implication was not. At the time that he was doing this report, Yeager was the CEO and owner of Winterhawk Well Abandonment, a company that rents equipment to reclaim abandoned wells. Yeager has a conflict of interest. That is not particularly hard to conclude, but that isn't exactly a problem for the province. In general, Alberta has chosen to let industry dictate how it is regulated and how the province approaches their energy future. Even when asked directly, Premier Smith did not rule out using taxpayer funds to clean up wells, instead simply saying that ideally, polluters would do it. But getting polluters to do it would mean charging the biggest companies larger levies, something that will never happen when you have a premier who is an ex-loyal lobbyist and a government that gives sole-sourced contracts to oil industry executives to come up with the plans on how the province should deal with the oil and gas industry going forward. Not to mention members of the AER board who have close connections with the Premier's office and are actively working with oil and gas companies. The industry says that smaller companies go bankrupt because of regulatory costs and environmental requirements, not companies' own bad decisions or a lack of vetting by the regulator. They will continue to push for the government to have even less oversight, while skirting their responsibilities to pay for the wells they used and profited off of. Instead, it's likely the Alberta government will continue putting more and more of the burden on the taxpayer, giving handouts to oil and gas companies, and writing off millions upon millions of taxes that companies can't pay when they go under. In the end, Alberta seems poised to privatize the profits and socialize the liabilities. Alberta should change the name of their policy from Polluters Pay to You Pay, Polluters Profit.